morning, everybody. Many thanks for joining this NeuroFest Members' Choice event today on exploring the diagnostic journey. I'm Sarah Rawlings. I'm Executive Director of Research and External Affairs at the MS Society, and it's a real pleasure to be chairing the event today. Advances in research, included those supported by organisations such as the MS Society, have helped ensure that we know much more than ever really about how to diagnose, target and treat a huge range of neurological conditions. However, we also know that getting a confirmed diagnosis can be exceptionally challenging, especially for more rare neurological conditions. And it can sometimes feel that you're being left in the dark, waiting for an explanation of your symptoms or to know exactly how you might be treated. At the same time, of course, services have faced unprecedented pressure over the last 18 months. And many are still trying to get to grips with the huge waiting lists in elective care, for example. I've heard from many healthcare professionals just how exhausted they are, but also how much they would value more support for the vital work that they do as well. It's in this context that we have this timely event today, which provides us with an opportunity to consider exactly how advances in research may improve or change the diagnosis journey for people with neurological conditions. We'll have the opportunity to hear from some fantastic panelists about how they think the journey might change and what system and information changes might be needed as well. We'll also get to hear Sarah's personal experiences of diagnosis and how the right information at the right time could have made all the difference. After the panel, we'll have the opportunity to discuss in a breakout group how you feel the diagnostic journey for your condition of interest might change, and also explore the opportunities and shared challenges that you face with others. And these discussions will be used by the Neurological Alliance to develop a short external briefing, which will be published early next year. Just to note, it is Remembrance Day today, so we are intending to take a short pause at 11 AM to observe the 1 minute silence, and we'll let you know when that time comes around. Thank you again for joining the event today. It's great to see you. And I'd now like to hand over to Sarah, who lives with Parkinson's, to talk about her experiences.
Morning, everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Sarah. My name is Sarah as well, Sarah Wiltshire. I'm 42 and I live in High Wycombe in Buckinghamshire with my husband and my daughter, who's called Elizabeth, who's 6 years old. I was diagnosed with Parkinson's in March 2017 when I was 38, which obviously came as a bit of a shock because it's not really it came as a shock despite the fact that my mum has Parkinson's disease. My mum was diagnosed when she was about 60. She's now mid-70s, so she's been living with Parkinson's disease for quite some time. But despite that, I didn't think that Parkinson's was really something that affected young people. And I hadn't appreciated the kind of genetics that can be involved in Parkinson's. So, you know, getting told at age 38 that I had it was quite shocking, especially as I was watching my mum's condition change over time. And, you know, at that point, you sort of think, well, if this is what's happening to mum, then it's likely to happen to me. In terms of how I ended up being diagnosed with Parkinson's, I began to feel that something wasn't right. And I would say it was sort of like springtime in 2016. I noticed that I was getting some stiffness in my left arm. And my arm wasn't swinging particularly well when I walked. But I think what was really telling for me was that I just didn't feel myself. My mood was low, which is unusual for me. I'm not somebody that sort of suffers from low mood, generally quite a happy, bubbly person. I had very low energy levels. I was tired all the time. And there was just something not right. And actually, I did think that I might have postnatal depression because at this point, because my daughter was born in October 2015. And sort of it was early 2016, I was thinking, I'm just feeling really grim. Maybe I'm struggling, with postnatal depression. So I made an appointment to see my GP. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to see the GP I normally see. So I saw a locum GP that I'd not seen before, and they thought that I might have a problem with my neck. And so they referred me for a neck x-ray. And I remember thinking at the time, there's nothing wrong with my neck. My neck feels perfectly fine. I don't, there's something to do. I thought it was some nerve problem in my arm. So they sent me for a neck x-ray, which was completely fine. And I just kind of got left. There wasn't really much of a follow-up. And I had to put a bit of pressure on my GP in the end and sort of force them to let me come in and see the GP that I had a bit of a history with. In fairness to him, when he saw me, he did say that he thought something neurological was going on and that I would need to be referred to a neurologist. And he did make a bit of a joke actually at the time and say, oh, because we talked about Parkinson's, I said, well, obviously mum's got Parkinson's, and he did sort of say, oh, you're too young to have Parkinson's. And to be honest, that's what I thought. So I was referred to a neurologist, and there was a little bit of a wait for the neurologist appointment, but actually it wasn't too bad. When I saw the neurologist, I took my sister along with me. She's a doctor. But she didn't think I had Parkinson's either. And it must have taken the neurologist all of about 5 minutes to diagnose me, because he made me walk. He did some tests where I had to sort of hit my knee with my hands. And I think to him, it was as plain as the nose on his face that it was Parkinson's. And this is before he realized that my mum also had Parkinson's. So he said to me, I'm almost certain you've got Parkinson's disease, which was very bizarre thing to be told. Then I said, oh, of course my mum has it, and then I think that for him kind of confirmed it. I don't think he was in any doubt at that point. He did refer me for an MRI because of my age. They wanted to rule out other things that could mimic the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And I actually found that the appointment where I was diagnosed was pretty good. I don't have any complaints about the way it was handled. The consultant's very sort of matter of fact and to the point, but actually that suits me. I like that approach. I don't want people to sort of beat around the bush. I'd rather they just sort of come and tell me what's what. And so I was perfectly happy with that. The only thing looking back that I wonder about is that I wasn't presented with any options. I was told, you've got Parkinson's disease. We need to put you on some medication. Here's a prescription. Go and take it. And actually the meds have worked very well, and I probably would have done the same thing anyway, but there were no kind of options presented. And I know that actually there are options around for treating Parkinson's disease, different medication approaches. Some people might say not to take any. I mean, it's only sort of since the appointment that I've done research into it, and I've realized that there are different schools of thought. As I say, it probably wouldn't have made much difference to the choice that I made, because actually the medications worked really well. But I do wonder whether it would be better if people were sort of, if the choices were explained at the time, just to be for more open discussion, really. My immediate concern when I was told that I had Parkinson's, which I did raise actually immediately with the neurologist, was, if my mum has Parkinson's disease and I have it, what about my daughter, who was only 1 at the time? I had visions of her developing Parkinson's at a young age, and that was the first thing that really played on my mind. And I mean, in fairness to him, there wasn't a huge amount he could say. He said that I'd been unlucky to have Parkinson's disease as well as my mother, and that he thought we'd be exceptionally unlucky if my daughter also had it. He did say he hadn't seen 3 generations of Parkinson's disease. I mean, I know that that's not the case. I know there are families where they have, it does run through the generations. But I thought he was, the way he dealt with it was probably about all he could do at the time. He was very understanding, and I was happy with that. We talked about my mum, and and about the fact that it is difficult to watch a loved one with a serious condition anyway, without the fact of having to worry about you sort of following in their footsteps. And I really am a sort of chip off the old block. Me and my mum are kind of virtually identical in every way, which is a good thing and a bad thing. And I think it's been good to see my mum cope so well with her diagnosis. But on the other hand, now she is starting to struggle, because she's had Parkinson's probably at least 20 years, because I think that everybody accepts that she was misdiagnosed initially for quite some time. And so it's starting to affect her now. And it is difficult, for me as a younger person to watch this happen and to think, well, if things don't improve in medical science terms, this could be my future. Since my diagnosis, I've obviously spoken to many different people about concerns and things that I have. And my other immediate concern, which I didn't raise with a neurologist, but I did speak to my mum about, and also my husband, was, just about my future in terms of my working life, because obviously I'm 42. I was expecting to work for many, many years. And obviously you don't retire now until you're 70, and it'll probably be higher by the time I get to that age. And so I was sort of panicky about whether I'd be able to pay my mortgage and things like this. I just didn't know at a young age. I'd never had cause to think about what happens if you have to take medical retirement, for example, from work. It had not been something that had ever entered my consciousness. So I sort of panicked about these things because I didn't have enough information. And I had to sort of go away and find it. And so I wonder whether more could be done at sort of the very early stage to give people, especially younger people, information about things like jobs and pensions. And I know you can go away and find it yourself, because there are some brilliant charities and, other websites that you can look at. But, I think it would be nice to be given something. You almost need not like a welcome pack. I know that sounds ridiculous, because you don't really want to be welcomed to, having Parkinson's, but just something like something that just has all the information in and where to find, links about where to find things. Once I spoke to people in the know, they were able to sort of put my mind at rest about panicking about paying my mortgage and that sort of thing. And I found I made the mistake. I'm the sort of person that just Googles everything. And so I came away from my diagnosis appointment, and the first thing I did was Google Parkinson's on the internet. And to be honest, that's not something that anybody should do, because the first thing, if you put Parkinson's in on Google, the first thing you get is this picture of this little hunched man with a walking stick. And, it's sort of quite frightening when you're young and you've just been told you've got something that there's no cure for. So I would certainly suggest to people not to do that sort of thing. Not initially anyway, but to actually go and look in the proper places for information. I think in terms of the future and how it would be good for things to change. For me, it was a little bit of a struggle getting to the point where I could see a neurologist, but in fairness, in my case, I think it wasn't too bad. It didn't take a desperately long time. It was kind of like sort of 7 or 8 months from me approaching the GP initially to sort of being diagnosed. I think in the scheme of things, that's probably not too bad. I think that for me, the most difficult thing was the fact that I was sort of told I had Parkinson's, then I was just lumped in with everybody else with Parkinson's disease. And it seemed to me that even as a sort of 38-year-old, I was being treated in exactly the same way as an 88-year-old who's told that they've got Parkinson's disease. Whereas I think, we can all appreciate that things are very different for a younger person and an older person. Of course, obviously, I've got a young family. I'm still working and hoping to work for a long time. So there are different considerations. And I'm not really sure that that's factored into things. And I think, for obvious reasons, the healthcare profession is under a lot of strain and they can't do everything. And, there probably needs to be collaboration between doctors and other groups to do this sort of thing. But it would have been nice if there'd have been if I'd have been talked to as a young person with Parkinson's and not just as a person with Parkinson's. And I remember the first time I went to the Parkinson's clinic, which is where I turn up for my it's my annual appointment with the Neurology team at the hospital, and they're all great. But I turned up and I was sitting in the waiting room, and I walked in there and I thought I must be in the wrong place, because I felt like a young, vibrant person, and I was surrounded by people who were clearly unwell, much older than me. And it was quite a sort of frightening experience. And I'm quite good at handling things like this, but I think for some people it must be quite, terrifying, to be honest. I think it would be nice if there was almost like a separate clinic for young onset Parkinson's disease people under a certain age. So you kind of get together with people that are in a similar position. I don't know whether anything like that would be possible, but I think it certainly would help in terms of mentally, and for people's well-being. And I suppose more awareness at GP level. I say that as if, it sounds like it's something easy to do, which I'm sure it isn't, because I think for a younger person, even with my mother having Parkinson's, it wasn't at the forefront of the GP's mind. And I can totally understand that, because there aren't that many under 40s that get diagnosed with Parkinson's. So I personally, I think obviously what would be brilliant would be advances in medical science. But if that doesn't happen, then I think there are ways that the sort of diagnosis process can be managed better. And I just think it's about thinking about people's individual circumstances a bit more, and not assuming that one size fits all and everybody's the same. And so that would be my main sort of takeaway from my experience so far. And I think the support groups have been great. Once I'd stopped Googling things, I actually went and approached the right people. But again, it wasn't necessarily easy to find that information. And I think it would have been nice to have been given something up front, or something to pick up at the hospital, which has links to all the groups that you could go to for like proper information. I mean, since being diagnosed, I've become quite involved in the groups, and I think they are great. I think it's just sort of getting people, getting awareness of them raised a bit more, and getting people try and coax them into wanting to look at these things. I know it's difficult, but I really do think that talking about things like this help, and it's helped me a lot. So yeah, I mean, I'm now sort of 4 years. Is it 4 years? Yeah, post-diagnosis, and doing pretty well. The medication's working well, and I've made some friends through some of these sort of support groups and everything. So it's something I would certainly recommend, and I think would be good if it could be recommended to people at early stages. Obviously, very happy to take any questions that anybody has as part of the panel Q&A later. But that's all I'm proposing to say for the time being. And I'll hand back to Sarah Rawlings. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah, for sharing your experiences. I think that really brings home, doesn't it, the importance of information and thinking about people's individual circumstances and the tailored support that you might have access to. So thank you again. I think that's really helped to frame the session today. Hopefully you've seen a message at the bottom of the screen. Do please start putting your questions into the chat, because we will have a chance for a very short Q&A later as well. I'd now like to introduce our next panellist, Dr. Jacquie Deeb. Jacquie is a consultant in clinical neurophysiology at Queen's Hospital and Great Ormond Street Hospital. She also joined the British Society for Clinical Neurophysiology Council in 2012, and in 2020 was elected as president. It's great to have you here today, Jacquie. Over to you.
My name is Jacquie Deeb. I'm a consultant in clinical neurophysiology and the current president of the British Society for Clinical Neurophysiology. I want to start by thanking the Neurological Alliance for inviting me to speak today about my specialty and the services we provide in the UK. So the title of my talk is How the Diagnostic Experience May Change in the Next Decade, taking a closer look at neurophysiology. So clinical neurophysiology, the outline of the talk, as I said, I'm going to start with an introduction of the specialty and the services provided and the service structure in different departments in NHS trusts. Then I'm going to move on to the improvements and developments in neurophysiology in the next decade and the implications of these on service provision. And I'm going to end up with, from all the discussion that I'll hold on the requirements from commissioners and health system leaders. So clinical neurophysiology is an allied specialty to neurology. It is predominantly a diagnostic specialty. So it uses different investigations using means of computer technology, electrical stimulation, magnetic stimulation, electronics, and different tests which are listed there, namely EEG, electroencephalography, evoked potentials, nerve conduction studies, electromyography, transcranial magnetic stimulation, just to name the most common one. And these are used to diagnose disorders of the brain and the spinal cord, spinal roots and peripheral nerves, and muscle and neuromuscular junction. And depending on the local needs and subspecialty interests of medical staff, and that is neurologists, neurosurgeons, orthopedic and spinal surgeons, rheumatologists, pediatrician, intensive care specialists, who are available in the trust or in the neuroscience unit. Then clinical neurophysiology can be used to monitor function during surgical operations on the brain, the spinal cord and peripheral nerves. It can be used to monitor progress of disease, especially in neurological, chronic neurological disorders, the effects of therapy in these patients, and be it the effect of therapy on the progress of the disease, or also to monitor for side effects of therapy. And also it can be used to prognosticate in patients, for example, after cardiac arrest in intensive care unit. And I can tell you from personal experience and also from feedback throughout the society, it's been very busy during the pandemic, especially the first phase where all the elective work was stopped, but most of the neurophysiology services were diverted to care of acute ill patient and intensive care patients in the intensive care unit. So clinical neurophysiology can be involved in the journey of patients with neurological disorders, including emergency admission, outpatient referral, and long-term management. The services are provided by 2 workforce groups in the departments, and these are formed by the medical consultants and also healthcare scientists or physiologists who help with the recording and the acquisition of the data of the tests, performing the test, and in some places in the interpretation as well of the results. And neurophysiology departments are based in almost all neuroscience centers across England, but there is a huge variability in the provision of services. And this was highlighted in the GERFT Neurology report, which was published in September 2021. So, for example, from this graph, you can see that the number of patients, outpatient appointments booked in neurophysiology per 100,000 total population can vary from less than 100 to more than 100,000. To almost 1,000. So there's almost a 10-fold difference between the service provision in different regions of the country. So what are the improvements and developments in neurophysiology in the next decade? And these are many, and I'm going to list a few there. For example, in epilepsy surgery and planning of epilepsy surgery, the use of stereo electroencephalography has been developed and refined over the last 2 decades. And this is a minimally invasive surgery to identify areas of the brain where seizures originate and help the surgeon in planning to maximize the benefit from the surgery, minimizing the risks and the side effects, and achieving seizure freedom in patients with epilepsy. The other one is home video telemetry, HVT, which is being developed in the 21st century, and it's been pioneered by the group in King's College in London in the first decade of the 21st century and rolled out into clinical practice in the second decade. This is a video which is prolonged recording of brainwaves for people with epilepsy that helps hugely with the management of these patients. It can be carried in the patient's own environment, and this is very, very useful for patients who have physical disability or learning difficulty, for example, but also it has proven very useful during the pandemic, where the hospitals were turned into acute green and orange sites, and there was a need for green site for these elective procedures. It will free up hospital beds, so more acutely ill patients can be looked up in hospitals. Automated analysis, which also is used in EEG analysis for automated seizure detection in prolonged recordings, but also in peripheral neurophysiology and EMG recordings for quantitative analysis. And again, these techniques have been developed over the last 2 to 3 decades and more refined, and this has been hugely helped with the advancement in technology and computing to assist with that. Other examples, other fields, areas of neurophysiology which are developing and becoming more and more popular and increasing in demand is intraoperative monitoring, which is an integral part of many intracranial and spinal surgeries and also peripheral nerve surgeries. And the intraoperative monitoring is provided by neurophysiology services to assist the surgeon in during the surgery to minimize the risks and the side effects and any deficits after the surgery, and sometimes to guide during the surgery. Non-invasive brain stimulation is another field as well, using, for example, transcranial magnetic stimulation. And a special group was developed last year in the International Federation of Clinical Neurophysiology, and to look at spinal cord spasticity induction, for example. So lots of exciting developments in non-invasive brain stimulation. Remote reporting with the advancement of the technology, where physically the consultant overlooking the service doesn't have to be present there and then during the test when it's recorded, but they can supervise the work and they can share their experience. They can contribute to multidisciplinary meetings at regional, national, and international levels as well. Ultrasound scan is another thing and of special interest to me specifically, and combining the use of ultrasound scan and nerve conduction study to diagnose peripheral nerves, peripheral nerve pathology, and traumatic nerve injuries. And that's it's being introduced in the training of neurophysiology in the UK, and it's featuring in almost all the national meetings that we organize here and coming into clinical service as well. So what are the implications of all these developments and demand on the service nationwide? Again, I'm going to highlight that there is a marked variation of the distribution of neurophysiology services in the UK. So, for example, the number of consultant neurophysiologists varies from 1.3 per million population to 4.8 per million population. And again, this is statistics from the GIRFT report. Newer technologies can definitely help, and they can be employed to enhance service delivery, remote reporting of EEG, for example, and home video telemetry, remote consultant supervision to enhance the service and help develop services. And this will take me to my last item on the for today's talk is so what are the requirements really from commissioners and health system leaders? It's mainly to tackle the health inequality and the flawed infrastructure that was uncovered by the COVID pandemic. And we do have the tools. Definitely, this has accelerated in the last 2 years. One of the advantages of the positive things that came out of the pandemic. And definitely neurophysiology is one area of diagnostics where digitization and improvement in the IT infrastructure can help to develop the services and make it more available. The neurophysiology services should be available to all large district general hospitals and within easy access for all outpatients. Newer technologies, as I said, they can help and be employed to enhance service delivery, improve in the IT infrastructure of departments and trusts in general to help to assist with these. And none of these can be developed without increasing the workforce. And I'm sure it's a theme which is across all the NHS you've been hearing about. And this brings me to my last slide. And we're all excited about the new announcement of the budget and the new budget for the NHS. And this could be seen, we see it as an opportunity to get investment in our diagnostic services and especially neurophysiology, and to streamline processes and pathways for patients. So this brings me to the end of my talk. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Jacquie. That was a really fantastic insight into the important role that neurophysiology plays, but also the variation in some access to services that you highlighted, which is really important, and also some of the exciting developments in the future that may help with some of that service delivery as well. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is Robert Annan. Robert has worked in a number of programme and project management roles within NHS hospitals in London and is currently working on a really exciting programme for physiological measurement transformation as a programme lead at NHS England and Improvement. So over to you, Robert.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me to your fantastic event. My name is Rob Annan. I am the programme lead for Physiological Measurements and Diagnostic Workforce, working from the Chief Scientific Officer's Office, NHS England and Improvement. I'd like to speak to you about the developments within diagnostics, NHS England and Improvement. As you may be aware, Professor Sir Mike Richards was commissioned to write an independent review on diagnostics entitled Recovery and Renewal, an absolutely exciting piece of work that was commissioned by the former Chief Executive, Lord Simon Stevens. The review came up with 22 recommendations on what needed to change to bring transformation within the 5 pillar groups of diagnostics, including imaging, pathology, genomics, endoscopy, and last but not the least, physiological measurements. It acknowledged that the demand for services had clearly outstripped their capacity significantly year on year, and we were falling well behind our European counterparts in providing excellent diagnostic services. This led to a huge backlog in waiting lists, especially in physiological sciences. This needed to be addressed imminently. The report acknowledged the fact that there were issues within the diagnostic workforce, including its expansion, estates and facilities, equipment. We all know how old some of the equipment really is, and digital and data improvements that needed to be made to improve efficiency within physiological measurements. And this all required lots of significant investment to bring the change that was needed. For example, with regards to digital and data, more reporting, for instance, could be carried out remotely, and data sharing within networks could help bring along efficiencies. Also discussed within the review are new models of care delivery, including the community diagnostic centres that are being set up across England, in which neurophysiological sciences will be delivered alongside. Clearly, the COVID-19 pandemic last year and ongoing has exacerbated the demand for our services, making waiting lists longer, delaying our elective recovery. Obviously, this has impacts on providing timely patient care when it's most needed to our neurological patients. As you know, physiological measurements consists of at least no less than 8 subspecialties, including neurophysiological sciences. It has sometimes been considered as a Cinderella specialty of diagnostics. As you can see, the piece of transformative work is very large. A lot of exciting investment has taken place within the imaging and pathology pillars, and plans are to replicate this within neurophysiological sciences. The developments in imaging and pathology have been driven more or less by a new data collection that has been established over the past few years. A lot of the problems we currently face, as a review states, is that we simply do not have sufficient data as a baseline, and this is especially an issue within physiological measurements. This is clearly a priority, as this is also stated clearly in the NHS long-term plan, along with its commitments to improve delivery of care. Once we have the data from the system, then we can start the transformation required. It means we can build better and stronger business cases and prepare bids for further investments based on the numerical evidence from the system to the Department of Health and Social Care, Treasury, and Government. It also means we can clearly identify where we can build efficiencies in the provision of our services. There are also exciting plans to develop networks within physiological measurements. These networks will help enable professionals to come together to share best practice and ideas, pool resources to improve patient care for physiological measurements. We are currently scoping out networks, what the ideal of a thriving one could look like, including looking at the governance, the operational structure, and to provide support to networks and guidance to set them up in future as required. The data will also help spot workforce gaps, help encourage trust working together in the best interest of neurological patients. We all know how a happy workforce will deliver better patient care to our neurological patients. The plan is to get the data onto model hospitals so providers can look at their own data and see whether they can find efficiencies and make improvements. We do currently have a strategy to bring transformation in this space, and we're currently in the process of building a data collection for neurophysiological sciences involving leads from across the system, involving various societies, including the Association of Neurological Sciences, ANS, CNLG, so we can get a workbook that's fit for purpose, and we plan to have a task and finish group to sign it off in early December. This will hopefully provide a clear picture of physiological sciences, in particular neurophysiological sciences, and the areas that require investment and change. We're also very closely working with the NHS England and Improvement National Specialty Advisor for Physiological Measurements, Dr. Martin Allen, and Ivan Ewan, the Senior Project Manager for Physiological Measurements. The new data collection will be rolled out to the system and should hopefully bring the insightful, granular data that providers can access and compare across the system. It also means that we're in a much better position to know what really is required to develop our services. This is the business intelligence that we need. The burning issues of the inadequacy of ESR when it comes to workforce numbers and the fact that the data that we currently have access to may not be complete will hopefully be resolved with a new comprehensive data collection fit for purpose with regards to this. We also know that the current DMO1, which is the mandatory collection for waiting list activity levels that providers submit regularly, has its strengths and weaknesses. And this is being looked into currently to see how best we can bring it up to date. The DMO1 does not cover all the diagnostic tests at the moment. There are important questions that we need to answer across physiological measurements, and the plan is to establish an annual stock take to request a one-off collection from the system each year and to see what the issues are across the board and check how they're changing with the increased investment. We're also planning a monthly collection to see what the activity levels are currently. Based on the data, we're planning to help support networks once we've been able to map them out across the system to see what levels of development they're at, whether they're emerging, developing, or thriving. The plan alongside is a new work stream that has been set up to reform the current DMO1, so we may be able to obtain a much clearer picture of what is going on with regards to waiting lists, backlogs, and activity levels. Once we have the data, we can scope out what exactly is required, and the further work can be carried out, such as on commissioning levers, contracts, pooling of resources, establishing networks, and supporting them to bring the transformation required within physiological measurement diagnostic services to be proud of and make a significant difference to patient outcomes and care. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. It's really helpful to hear about the transformation programme and the data collection plans as part of the conversations that we have today. So thank you for that. And now we're on to our final speaker, Professor Nick Wood. Nick is currently UCL Professor of Genetics, a consultant neurologist, and the NIHR Programme Director for Neurosciences at UCLH. Thank you so much for joining us today, Nick, and it's over to you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I was meant to join for the whole session, but I double booked myself. I've just nipped out of clinic, so apologies for being halfway through. Okay, so I decided not to do slides, which may come as a relief to many of you, I'm not sure. I just thought I'd be willing to take questions, but I just thought maybe I'd give a few minutes of where I think genetic diagnoses have been and are currently and where they might go in the near future. Okay. I've been doing this job now as a consultant neurologist at Queen Square, the National Hospital, for 26 years, just over. So when I first started doing the genetic clinic that I run on a Friday afternoon, where we see a range of pretty rare or sometimes very rare complex neurological conditions, we would have a hit rate in the clinic of maybe 10%, something like that, where we knew the genetic diagnosis, and that's in the mid-90s. You think the first, some of the major genes being found for neurological disease were in the early 90s, Huntington's disease in 1993, Kennedy's disease in 91, some of the ataxias in the early mid-90s. So we had a small batch of genes that we could routinely analyze. There were a few neuropathy genes, and that was it. So 90% of the clinic came to see me. I would be suspicious that they had a genetic condition, but I couldn't diagnose them, to fine-grain diagnose them. And therefore, that limited the information that that person and their family had about the prognosis for that disease. It also limited the impact that they could understand for their family. So what were their brothers and sisters at risk? Were their children at risk? Very important factors, of course, for individuals. Clearly, the main reason for trying to find genes is not just to butterfly collect for this gene and that gene. It's about discovering the biology, and therefore you can understand the process of the disease and therefore design rational treatments. So that's the aim. Okay. So as the years have gone by, many more genes have been found. And, you know, if I look back 15, 20 years, it was a really big deal. To find a new gene, you'd get your name in a big paper, in a big journal, and you might even find yourself on the BBC webpage because you'd found a gene for Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's or something like this. As the years have gone by, we've got much better and much quicker at finding genes. In fact, today is timely. I don't know if many of you are listening to Radio 4 today or looked on the BBC webpage. You know, one of the news stories today is about the 100,000 genomes paper that's come out today in the New England Journal, of which I happen to be a co-author along with lots of other people. But maybe I'll talk about that in a moment. So we have just ramped up massively our ability to find genes. Now, how we've done that, the main thing that's really driven it isn't scientific development per se, it's technological development. So if you think back to 20 years ago, when the Human Genome Project was solved or announced by Tony Blair and George W. back then, wasn't it? No, it was Clinton, I think. Clinton was still in power. They announced that the draft human genome was available in 2001. Now, it was an incomplete draft, and we knew that, but for a whole bunch of reasons, some of them quasi-political, they announced it there and then. That had taken about 10 years, about $3 billion to sequence one genome. So our genome is about 3 billion base pairs, 3 billion letters. If I put that into some sort of context for you, if I start reading the book of a genome, my genome or anybody's genome, and I read quite quickly, and they're made up of the letters A, C, T, G, as you probably all know, and I start A, C, T, T, A, C, D, and go on throughout the genome, even reading at the pace I just did there for a few seconds, it would take me about 35 years to complete. So it's a massive, massive space, and that is important to work out. So when we're talking about a whole genome being sequenced, sequencing it now is not that difficult. For example, the cost of sequencing genome now is well below $1,000. So the first one was $3 billion. It's now $1,000, which is about the same price as an MRI scan. So getting the sequence is not the problem. Making sense of it is. And that's almost where computational issues have lagged behind, because although computers have come down in price, we all know we get a better iPhone every couple of years, or a better laptop or faster computer and so forth every few years. It's not kept up with the pace of change in the sequencing. And so therefore, paradoxically, it is cheaper to sequence a genome than it is to store it. And not just store it, you want to interrogate it. And you have to do a whole bunch of computational things, what's called aligning and so forth, to make sense of it. And those methods are being improved all the time. So in the last few years, we've had the 100,000 genomes, which means, as the name suggests, we've sequenced 100,000 individuals and we've sequenced pretty much the entire genome. It's not the entire genome as it happens, because we still don't fully, we don't have a complete map. And if you don't have a complete map, you don't know when you've got a complete genome. So it's 90-something% of a genome when we say it's a complete genome, but it's a pretty damn good try. But, and this is where it's quite a big but, the problem is, as it's a very big space, as I've just said, 3 billion letters, we can't very easily or in any systematic way understand every particular variation. Every one of us listening to this talk now, myself included, has some mutations. We all carry some mutations. I don't know what mine, I've never had my genome sequenced, so I don't know what mine are, but there's a good chance, if you look at my genome, I will have some mutations that look quite bad for certain genes. And yes, I hope I feel healthy, I am healthy, I think, and same goes for many of us on this call. So we can carry, our genomes can tolerate some quite bad looking mutations, and it doesn't seem to affect us. Therefore, if you're sequencing a whole bunch of people, finding a bad mutation doesn't automatically mean that's the one that's causing their ataxia or their dementia or their Parkinson's. And so it's not as easy as one might think to assign pathogenicity to a variant, to a phenotype. But that's why we need large-scale projects, because what the 100,000 genome has done is collect a lot of people with developmental delay, a lot of people with ataxia, a lot of people with what have you. And that gives you a greater chance of finding mutations that are relevant. It's also what the whole genome, what the 100,000 genomes have done so far is basically look at what we call panels. Whereas, I don't know, 15 years ago, if I had a PhD student, they might take a year to sequence 100,000 of base pairs, letters in the genome to study a gene in some detail. It could take an awfully long time and a lot of hard graft. Now, as I said, you can sequence the whole genome in less than a day. So we can move very, very much more quickly than we could. But what we haven't yet got is a systematic way of being able to understand the mutations and the variation outside of the panels that we ought to know. So if you come to me now and see me on a Friday afternoon and you've got ataxia, I will do the ataxia panel. If you've got neuropathy, I'll do the neuropathy panel. If you have a bit of neuropathy and a bit of ataxia, I'll do both panels, and so on. But so they're still measured in a few hundred genes, not the 21,000 genes that humans carry in their genomes. So this, although it's a great mark, it's a great effort the UK has done to get this 100,000 genomes. There is quite a lot more work to be done, but it will happen. It is going to happen. Before COVID, Matt Hancock, I'm very careful what I say, when he was health secretary, he announced that we were going to do another million, and then it's going to be another 5 million genomes. And that was delayed by COVID, because obviously the NHS turned its attention to the pandemic, but it's starting to ramp up again now. So I think in the near future, I want to say nearly everybody, if not everybody, who has a potential genetic disease will have the opportunity to have the whole genome sequenced. I really think that's very likely indeed. So that's where I think we're going in the next year, 2 years, 3 years. What we hope is that by doing that, we will start to understand every gene and what it does in both normal function and what it does when it's in abnormal function, and thereby be able to influence that function to improve therapy. Now, that's not just a pie in the sky, over aspirational risk. Let me give you a couple of examples. First off, I just want to talk about something that came out very recently in the New England Journal again. It came out about 5 months ago. This child was, I think, a few months old. I can't quite recall. Very early life. Had a severe epilepsy syndrome. Had an older sibling who died of an epilepsy syndrome, and came in with seizures. So, and the parents understandably were very frantic because they knew what had happened with their previous child earlier. And so they took some DNA from the parents and the child. They sequenced it in a few hours, the whole genome in a few hours. They used machine learning and artificial intelligence to what was called a line to do the computational analysis. That took another hour and a half, 2 hours. They then found a mutation in a gene that was in a vitamin response gene, and therefore they felt there was an element of chance of using that vitamin replacement to solve the illness. They went to the pharmacy. It took longer for the pharmacy to get the vitamin delivery than it did to sequence the genome. They gave the child the vitamin, and the child stopped fitting and went home within, I think, 24 or 48 hours. It was an amazing success. Now, it was an amazing story, is an amazing story, and most genetic discoveries are not so overtly and obviously and easily therapeutic as that. But nevertheless, it gives you the idea that there are opportunities like that for us to grab as a society. That's one example. The second example was about 3 years ago. There's a condition called spinal muscular atrophy. It's a motor neuron problem. It comes on very early in life, SMA for short, it's called. It's one of the commoner genetic ones, actually. It's recessively inherited, so the parents are healthy. The mutations come together in that child, and the child, when severely affected, never learns to sit, roll, walk, and usually dies at about 2.5 years of age of respiratory distress, and it's incredibly sad. We've known the gene since about 95, 96, and two different approaches, basically gene therapy approaches. One was getting this gene to reactivate in a way, and one was to use a complementary gene to get that to take up the molecular slack to mimic the action of the gene. So very similar, but basically all you need to know, two independent groups, different genetic approaches, both published absolutely astounding data of the improvement given by this treatment. They had to stop the trial because it was so obvious that the drug was working, that the gene therapy was working. It's very expensive gene therapy, and it's just been licensed in the UK a few months ago. But it's absolutely life-changing for this genetic condition. And so that shows you, if you diagnose early enough, get in there early enough, and have the right gene construct therapy, you can fix complex, or start to fix complex neurological issues. Now, there's lots of other rare genetic diseases. We estimate there's about 7,000 rare genetic diseases. Now, our nervous systems are very complicated, as we all appreciate, the most complicated organ we know of in the universe, actually. And therefore, it's not surprised to find that most genetic diseases, or over half genetic diseases, have a neurological flavor: muscle, nerve, spinal cord, cortex, basal ganglia. Some part of the nervous system gets diseased by a mutant gene. And therefore, the impact of this genomic discoveries and genomic approaches is going to be felt most, I think, by neurological patients. Now, that's the positive, optimistic side, and I am an optimistic person. There is reality, of course. The nervous system is very complicated. Our wirings, I've got a motor nerve starts up here in my brain here. It's the 3 foot, I'm 6 foot, just over 6 foot tall. I've got a long motor nerve that goes down my spine, millions of them, to operate my legs. When those get diseased in spastic paraplegia, I've got to fix a 3 foot, very fine nerve. It's not like fixing a liver cell or a lung cell or a skin cell. So it's, fixing neurology is not without its challenges. Of course it isn't. But I think in the next 5, 10 years, we'll see slowly upon slowly more precise genomic and genetic therapies for neurological disease. Finally, I'll stop before I take some questions, so I have time for questions. It's not just genomic therapies for genetic diseases. That is the first thing that will be cracked, I think. But actually, if we think about common diseases, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and so forth, we now know quite a few genes and molecules that are involved in producing those diseases. Beta amyloid in Alzheimer's, alpha-synuclein in Parkinson's, and so on. There's a bunch of others. And therefore, there are strategies being developed by a range of companies to manipulate the gene that produces the abnormal protein in the hope that you can mitigate or abrogate the process of the disease itself. So genomic approaches, genomic therapies won't be just confined to relatively rare genetic diseases. And on that point, it's worthwhile saying, although we call them rare diseases, they are rare. There's so many of them, 1 in 17 of us carries a rare genetic disease. So cumulatively, it is a massive burden to those patients, obviously, to their families, and society at large. So there's a massive motivation, not just a moral motivation or a medical motivation, but even a financial motivation, that if we can abrogate these effects and make people better, less dependent on care, then actually we're obviously doing a service to them, clearly, but we're doing a service to society in terms of expenditure as well. So I think I'll stop there for the moment, but happy to take any questions as they emerge. I don't know if that's going to be in the chat or live. I'm going to leave somebody to guide me.
Thanks, Nick. That's brilliant. It's really great to hear how fast things are moving, and also it gives a lot of hope for the future as well, which is fantastic. We do have some time now for a Q&A, so if you do have any questions, do please pop them in the chat. We'll bring the panel together, I think, as a few questions have already come in, which is fantastic. So I think we might start, actually, Nick, with a very, very specific question that's been asked that's for you. It's a question from Sue, who says, at the moment, what is the cost of whole genome sequencing against sequencing against a panel of, say, 200 genes? Is the cost hugely
Yeah,
different?
they're very similar actually. So they're not that far apart. In actual fact, what happens with the whole genome? We sequence 3 billion letters, and then we say, well, okay, what's the patient got? Have they got dementia? Have they got ataxia? Have they got whatever? And then you look at those 200 genes or the 500 genes, whatever the number is, because, well, I'm not going to spend too much, but essentially, because those genes are known to cause the condition, it's easier to know whether a variant in that gene is likely to cause the ataxia or the phenotype. If I find a variant in a gene outside, it's much harder to know if that is the one that's really causing the trait of interest. And that's where we're going to need more numbers. And the UK is ahead of the game here. I think with 100,000 genomes, and if we do 1 million genomes, I think we'll be in a very good position to be able to offer a much more sophisticated approach to that. But the direct answer to your question is it's actually about the same price. It's I'm not going to say it's trivial, but it's about £500 for a genome. A bit less now if you're doing it in a very large scale system. For the genome sequencing bit, getting a clever scientist to think how to align it all is a bit more expensive.
Thank you for that. We now have two linked questions following on from Sarah sharing her experiences of her diagnosis earlier. One is from Jan, who says, I work for MyAware, a small charity which supports people with myasthenia. I hope that's correct. I wonder how we can improve awareness of the services offered by charities such as ours. Sarah Wiltshire spoke earlier about her diagnosis of Parkinson's, and being given information at the point of diagnosis would be helpful. And linked to that is another question as well around what advice do you all have, or do you have any advice? How do people actually go out and find sensible information rather than scary details at certain points in their diagnosis? Who would like to start? Does anybody have any top tips?
I'm happy to say something. I mean, I made the sort of mistake that everybody makes, I think, just by putting things into Google, and then all sorts of hideous things pop up. So I think if I'd have been given like a sheet, I don't know, something when I was diagnosed that said these are the websites to look at, I would have gone away and looked at them, and I wouldn't have sort of frightened myself by, reading stuff that I probably shouldn't have done just 20 minutes after being told you've got Parkinson's. So I think there's just something about some kind of first-hand awareness raising right at the beginning of the process. I know it's easier said than done, but that would have helped me for certain.
Yeah, I'll chip in as well a little bit. I agree. I think but it's inevitable as well, isn't it? I mean, if I was told I had something and I hadn't heard of it, I would definitely go and Google it. I mean, I would. I mean, my family would, and it is nature. It is the world we are now in, and that's what people do. But you're absolutely right. Some of the stuff out there is nonsense, and some of it's look at the anti-COVID vaccine stuff. I mean, some of it's absolute madness. So we can delude ourselves as humans. But I think where I would say where I found in the UK is well placed is there are some very, very good disease-based charities who've got very sensible information. Parkinson's UK, Ataxia UK, HSP Society. There's a bunch of Alzheimer's societies as well. So I would start with there, because they've often got very thoughtful and thought through brochures, booklets, web links for people to access. But I agree with Sarah that if doctors could be maybe a little bit more proactive in directing people to those sites, that might help as well.
Great, thank you. Just a reminder that we are going to pause for a minute at 11, so I think we probably have time just for one more question before we do that. And I was going to ask, actually, we've spoken a lot about the pressure that services are under today and the impact that COVID pandemic has had. I wondered if, how long do you think it's going to take for services to recover? And obviously there's huge workforce issues, and a lot of issues that existed pre-pandemic have been identified, but is there light at the end of this tunnel?
Okay, well, Jacquie will probably speak for neurophysiology and other things, but so from an outpatient in the National Hospital, I'm going to speak for one hospital, and I'm sorry, it's just one hospital, this is my experience, is we are, if anything, slightly better off than we were pre-pandemic. And the reason for that is that when we went into the pandemic mode and the registrars were co-opted to do ITU work and so forth, nearly all my colleagues, myself included, did extra clinics to keep up with the outpatient. So the outpatient turnover at the National has actually been as good as any year that we've had. Now, that's the good bit, but the problem with that is we order tests. We ask Jacquie and people like her to do physiology, and we ask neurosurgeons to remove brain tumours, and they were really hit by patient contact things like Jacquie's field, ITU bed for surgery. So there is a definite backlog for some of the things around neurology. But for outpatient neurology, in this part of the world, down in the southeast, it isn't the true all over the country, I know that, it is actually not too bad, paradoxically. I don't know what Jacquie thinks.
Yeah, I agree.
If it's okay, Jacquie, I wonder if we could go to the minutes silence and come back at 1 minute. Back to you. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Great. We'll let everybody know when we're back. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for that. We felt it was important to mark Remembrance Day today. So thank you for coming back as well. Jacquie, we're about to hear from you in terms of recovery from the pandemic.
Yeah. So Nick is right. So services, they do vary a lot, as I mentioned in my talk as well. They do vary a lot, and they did actually across the country during the pandemic. One is because of the state before the pandemic, as highlighted by the GOV report. And second, because different parts of the country were hit by the pandemic at different levels, during different stages. So during the first phase, I think everybody was almost the same, but as things were starting to recover in the summer, and then the second wave came on. And one thing that the NHS acknowledged, I think learned from the first phase, is that diagnostic services are essential. And because patients were being the diagnosis was very delayed. They were presenting with very sick and advanced conditions. So we are one of the specialties that we couldn't actually hold virtual consultations. All has to be done face to face. So the services were not withheld in the second phase, and this did help to provide the support for the COVID patients in the inpatient services, but also to tackle some of our outpatient load. And I think we did quite well. It's still in the recovery phase, but most of the departments have recovered by now. And again, as Nick mentioned, because people put the extra effort doing the extra clinics, doing weekend clinics, evening clinics, to catch up and to make sure no patients are missed, especially the urgent ones. But going forward, maintaining this level of practice is difficult. And as I said, because we don't have many other alternatives apart from strengthening the IT infrastructure. So for us in neurophysiology, that will be an essential part to carry this forward and to be able to maintain it and to develop the service and to roll it out to regions where it's not available. And we are working with Robert actually at a national level for the diagnostic services to see taking it forward if part of the services maybe can be taken into the community. Where there will be hopefully less disruption with, with sort of seasonal variations, and also expand the services as such.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jacquie. That's really helpful to hear. Can I just say thank you to all of our panelists today. It's been fantastic to hear from you as part of this event. We're now going to head into our breakout group discussions that will be facilitated by Georgina, where we'll have the opportunity to discuss how the diagnostic journey might change for people with your condition, and what information and services changes might be required as well. So I think, do people just need to click on the breakout room 1 button? Brilliant. Thanks so much, everybody. That was a really interesting discussion in the breakout rooms. Georgina, did you want to summarise what some of those key themes were?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. So thanks everybody again for your input into that. I guess one of my reflections from this meeting is actually there could be plenty more discussions that we could have around kind of developments in neurophysiology. We haven't even touched really on neuroradiology and indeed on genomics, etc. as well. But I guess some of the kind of key themes that people were raising was exploring some of the ethical issues around kind of genomic sequencing and what does that mean for kind of information support, the future. Talked about the need, again, for kind of personalised support, reflecting on, Sarah W's experience in particular, and recognising that actually kind of people's individual needs and motivations, etc., might differ. We talked, about kind of the again, just going back to ethics, but there could be potential kind of bias around genetic discrimination, that sort of thing. So, we need to be having some of those discussions now, and then finally, really, looking again at the workforce and recognizing that, we need to absolutely build and support kind of the right workforce to ensure that, improvements in diagnostics translate to improvements in quality of life. And I think Robert, in his talk, summarised it really well. If you've got a happy workforce, then you'd hope that you have happy patients as well. But as I say, we will pull these themes together into a briefing, and this discussion is also going to be available, for anybody that couldn't make it today. So yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Georgina. Yeah, I think you've just summarised the breakout group and also the conversations that we've had across the hour and a half day really, really well. That brings us to the end of our event today, and many thanks to everyone that's taken part. I'd like to say a huge thank you to Sarah, Jacquie, Robert and Nick. Your contributions have been, invaluable today as we've kind of explored the diagnostic journey during the event. I hope to see some of you at other NeuroFest events that are taking place over the next week. More information can be found on the Neurological Alliance website. But thank you again for joining today.
Great, thank you. Bye-bye.